On the night of October 30th, 1503, inside the Apostolic Palace, something happened that would rattle the Christian world. Beneath ceilings meant to glorify God, 50 naked courtesans crawled across the icy marble floor. Cardinals and bishops stood motionless, choking on the weight of what they saw. At the center of it all sat Pope Alexander VI, watching, smiling, even laughing. He ruled over the scene as if it were his own warped celebration. But that moment was only the beginning. The real horror had yet to unfold. What followed was so vile, so violently opposed to everything sacred, that even hardened historians later struggled to put it into words. This is the story of Lucrezia Borgia, a woman born into a family where power mattered more than blood, faith, or mercy. A woman whose wedding night became one of the darkest marks in Vatican history. If dark secrets of the past draw you in, subscribe to Grim History, tap like, and when the moment hits you hardest, tell me where you're watching from. Let's begin. In the fall of 1503, the bells of St. Peter's rang through Rome with news that spread like wildfire across Italy. The Pope announced that his daughter, twice widowed under suspicious circumstances, would marry again. But this time, there would be no distant court or quiet chapel. The wedding would be held inside the Vatican, in the papal apartments, beneath holy frescoes meant to symbolize heaven's judgment. Her groom was Alfonso d'Este, heir to the powerful Duchy of Ferrara. To the outside world, the match looked like a political victory. To Alfonso, it felt like a death sentence. Lucrezia's past followed her like a shadow. Her first husband, Giovanni Sforza, fled Rome claiming assassins were after him. Her second, Alfonso of Aragon, was strangled on the steps of the Vatican, rumors pointing straight to her brother, Cesare Borgia. Now, another Alfonso was being tied to the Borgia name. He understood the danger. Every noble in Italy did. Trying to escape what he knew awaited him, Alfonso delayed, made excuses, begged through envoys. But Alexander VI did not accept defiance. Inside the Vatican, surrounded by scarlet-robed cardinals, his will was law. Messengers rode day and night to Ferrara with one message: accept this marriage or face destruction. If the Este family resisted, Cesare's armies would come, their dynasty would crumble, and excommunication would leave them isolated and powerless. Italy knew the truth well. No one survived a clash with the Borgias. Seeing that resistance meant ruin, Duke Ercole d'Este ordered his son to go to Rome and submit to the alliance. While this played out, Lucrezia stood in her Vatican rooms, staring over the city with sorrow far heavier than her 21 years. To Europe, she was a temptress, a poisoner, a woman who played men like pawns. But those closest to her knew better. She was not the puppet master they were. Her first marriage was erased the moment it stopped serving their ambition. Her second husband, the only man she truly loved, was murdered before her eyes. A tragedy she was powerless to stop or avenge. Her attendants whispered that she woke in the night clutching her chest, shaking from nightmares she would not name. She knew this third marriage would bring no happiness. But even she could not imagine what her wedding night would become. Something cold, deliberate, and cruel was forming behind the walls of the Vatican. Preparations moved quickly, but the air inside the Apostolic Palace felt heavy and tense. Servants avoided eye contact. Cardinals spoke in low voices. Shadowy figures slipped through forbidden halls at strange hours. Rumors spread of secret orders and guests slipping in through hidden tunnels. No one felt the weight of it more than Johann Burchard, the Vatican's master of ceremonies. He had witnessed endless scandals under Alexander VI, lavish banquets, open bribery, holy offices sold like trinkets. Yet this night unsettled him in a way nothing else had. He knew this would overshadow every disgrace he had ever recorded. He felt it in his bones. He was about to witness something history itself would struggle to name. The trap was already built, polished and inescapable, and both bride and groom were walking straight into it. In December, Alfonso d'Este arrived in Rome with a small escort. His journey from Ferrara had been slow and brutal. Frozen passes, broken roads, and a dread that grew heavier with every mile. Still, nothing prepared him for the Vatican itself. It rose over the city like a stone giant, half glowing with candlelight, half wrapped in scaffolding. It looked less like a holy sanctuary and more like a fortress meant to devour anyone who stood against it. Inside, the welcome was overwhelming and suffocating. Alexander VI sat on his throne, draped in white and gold that gleamed like molten fire. At his side stood Cesare, silent and still, terrifying in his control. Only 26, yet already feared across Italy. Cities fell at his approach. Families vanished at his word. When his eyes met Alfonso's, the message was clear: you are not safe here. Over the following weeks, Alfonso endured humiliation dressed up as celebration. At banquets, courtesans were placed at his side while senior clergy watched with thin smiles. On hunts, Cesare's deadly skill felt less like sport and more like warning. At receptions, the Pope made casual remarks about how Lucrezia's previous husbands had met their ends. Every word carried the same meaning: you belong to us now. And still, the worst had not yet begun. Cesare flaunted his dominance on every hunt, each fallen beast a reminder of the fear he commanded. At court, Alexander joked openly about how brief the lives of Borgia sons-in-law tended to be. Alfonso tried to hold on to what dignity he had left, but he was already a prisoner dressed in silk and ceremony. At night, he was kept isolated under shallow excuses, watched constantly by papal guards. With every passing hour, the truth sharpened. He had walked into a trap with no exit. The marriage itself was only a performance. The real goal was far darker: to crush the pride of the Este family, to humiliate them before all of Italy, and to warn every noble house that no bloodline was beyond Borgia reach. And while Alfonso endured this silent psychological siege, another kind of preparation was unfolding deep inside the Vatican. Cesare personally took control of the wedding feast, and his plans went far beyond even Rome's most whispered excesses. Behind closed doors, he met with his father to finalize details that would have sickened anyone who still believed in the Church. 50 of Rome's most striking courtesans were chosen and hidden in chambers beneath the palace. These were not common women, but educated companions of noble salons. Many trembled when they learned what was demanded of them, yet none dared refuse the head of Christendom. They were dressed in rich velvet and silk, clothes they were later ordered to shed. By lantern light, they were guided through secret corridors so they could be released into the papal apartments without warning on the wedding night. Servants who glimpsed these movements crossed themselves in fear, whispering prayers through pale lips. They felt something unholy taking shape inside the Vatican. Even Lucrezia sensed it. Though kept away from most of the planning, she felt the darkness thickening in the air. Her maids spoke of unfamiliar faces in forbidden halls, courtesans appearing where they did not belong, and Cesare moving through the palace with a smile that made their blood run cold. The night before the wedding, unable to breathe in the tension any longer, Lucrezia slipped away to the Sistine Chapel. Beneath Michelangelo's roaring sky and the outstretched hand of God, she fell to her knees. She didn't pray for love or joy, only for rescue, for a sign, for anything that might save her. Nothing answered. The chapel stayed silent. God felt impossibly far away. Candle flames trembled in the winter draft, creeping through ancient cracks, struggling just to stay lit. Beyond those walls, the Vatican prepared for a celebration that would twist sacred ritual into something unholy. In his chambers, Johann Burchard reviewed the final ceremony plans, his hand shaking as he wrote. He knew whatever he recorded next would either vanish forever or become the Church's most damning witness. October 30th, 1503, was closing in, carrying a spectacle that would drag even the Vatican toward hell. Morning arrived with all the splendor of a papal wedding. St. Peter's bells thundered across Rome. Crowds packed the streets, desperate for a glimpse of the infamous bride. Inside the apostolic palace, Lucrezia was dressed by a dozen attendants. Her gown shimmered with gold-threaded silk, glowing like fire beneath candlelight. Pearls were woven into her long braids. Her face was powdered pale to hide the fear and exhaustion in her eyes. When she looked into the mirror, she did not see a bride. She saw an offering. The ceremony took place in the papal chapel, drowning in gold and holy images. Alexander VI presided himself, his voice echoing as he bound Lucrezia and Alfonso before God. Rows of scarlet-clad cardinals stood rigid, their faces locked in practiced devotion. But behind the masks lived something else: fear. They all knew the Borgia name, and they all sensed this was only the beginning. Afterward, the guests were led into the Borgia apartments, their frescoed halls telling stories of saints and heroes now stained by what was coming. The banquet tables sagged under roasted boar, feathered pheasants, exotic fruit, and endless wine. Cardinals, Roman nobles, Ferraran envoys, and chosen courtiers filled the hall. Alfonso and Lucrezia sat at the head table, trapped inside a celebration that already felt unreal, like a performance hiding something rotten underneath. At first, it followed the rhythm of any noble feast. Lutes and viols played softly, toasts rose, compliments rang hollow, diplomacy smiled politely. But as the night wore on, the mood shifted. Alexander, red-faced with drink, grew louder and more animated. Cesare, silent until then, stood and gave a brief nod. The massive doors slammed shut. Guards stepped forward. No one was leaving. The final barrier between excess and evil collapsed. At Cesare's signal, side doors opened, and 50 courtesans entered, wrapped in velvet and jewels, terror shining through their eyes. The room fell into a choking silence. Then the Pope rose, smiling as if unveiling a gift, and announced the true entertainment had begun. At his command, the women stripped away silk and velvet, one layer at a time, until their clothes pooled at their feet and they stood naked before the court. A place built for prayer now stared into a living blasphemy. Cardinals turned away, crossing themselves with shaking hands. Some tried to stand and flee, but guards rested hands on sword hilts, making escape impossible. Alfonso stared in frozen horror. Beside him, Lucrezia wept without sound, tears soaking into her wedding gown. Her hands crushed together in her lap until her knuckles went white. Then came the next command. The naked courtesans were ordered to dance between the banquet tables. Towering candles were lit, casting warped shadows across the sacred walls. The women moved through the firelight like ghosts, their shapes twisting over images of saints and angels. Saints and angels stared down from the walls as the Vatican slipped fully into a pagan nightmare. And still, Alexander was not finished. In a final act of calculated humiliation, he ordered baskets of chestnuts scattered across the marble floor. They rolled between the guests' feet, the soft clatter echoing through the stunned hall. Then the Pope announced the next command. The naked courtesans were to crawl on all fours between the legs of cardinals and nobles to gather the nuts, like animals in a twisted game. The woman who collected the most would win silk cloaks, gold jewelry, and treasures from the papal vault. The degradation that followed was so extreme that even Johann Burchard later admitted he could barely bring himself to describe it. 50 naked women crawled across the sacred floor between the robes of church princes, while Alexander and Cesare watched from above, laughing, pointing, placing bets as if this were a tavern spectacle instead of the heart of Christendom. Some younger cardinals, drunk and swept up in the madness, laughed and cheered. Others hung their heads, torn between faith and terror. Alfonso sat frozen, unable to grasp that this nightmare was his wedding feast. Inside the Vatican, under the eyes of the man who claimed to speak for God. And Lucrezia, her gown had become a burial shroud. Her tears had dried into a hollow stare. She had always known what her father and brother were capable of, but she never imagined they would turn her wedding into a ritual of damnation. Still, the night had not reached its darkest depth. As midnight struck and the Vatican clocks echoed 12, Alexander finally called an end to the chestnut game. The courtesans collapsed into corners with their shameful rewards. Wine soaked the tables. Guests sat half-drunk, half-numb, completely shattered. But Alexander was steady, focused, and when he spoke again, the hall fell into such silence that candle flames could be heard cracking. With absolute authority, he declared that the sacred duty of marriage must now be fulfilled. Then he delivered the order that crushed what little dignity remained. Alfonso d'Este was to prove the marriage with Lucrezia 3 times, and not in private. Everyone present was commanded to stay and witness it, so the union would be sealed beyond dispute. Horror flooded the room. Even Cesare turned sharply toward his father. Alfonso rose slowly, his face drained of color. A prince raised on honor, now surrounded by armed men with hands on sword hilts. He understood refusal meant death. He looked at Lucrezia. She shook like prey beneath a predator's shadow. Her eyes were empty, her will already broken. Her lips moved, but no sound came. With guards watching and the Pope's gaze burning into him, Alfonso had no choice. He led Lucrezia into an adjoining chamber, once a diplomatic room, now turned into a bridal prison. The doors stayed wide open. There was no privacy, no mercy. Those who remained were forced to stand in full view. What followed was not a union. It was the ruin of 2 human beings. Witnesses stood in stunned silence. Some whispered frantic prayers. Others wept softly. Even the courtesans looked away in grief. And as the Pope's command unfolded hour by hour, one silent truth filled the Vatican. Something sacred had died inside those walls. Rome would never be the same. By the final hours of night, Lucrezia had drifted beyond fear, beyond exhaustion. Her mind fractured to survive. She moved without thought, as if her soul had fled to escape what her body could no longer endure. And just as the first pale light of dawn crept through the windows, Pope Alexander issued the command for the 3rd and final act. Cesare stood watch again, overseeing it with the same cold precision he used on the battlefield. When it was finished, he declared the marriage bound 3 times, sealed before church and law, impossible to undo. Alexander lifted his wine cup in satisfaction, smiling as if the night had been nothing more than lavish celebration instead of a moral abyss. All that remained in the room were the survivors, broken souls left behind. The cardinals who had entered in scarlet as servants of God now stood as silent witnesses to an atrocity they could never confess. Their fear and their silence made them complicit. When the sun finally rose over Rome, it revealed the full ruin of the night. Empty wine jugs littered the hall. Chestnuts were crushed into the marble. Exhausted courtesans lay curled in corners. Guards stood motionless, eyes lowered in shame. In the adjoining chamber, Lucrezia lay perfectly still, staring upward as if her soul had drifted somewhere far beyond reach. Her body remained. Her spirit did not. Alfonso sat on the edge of the bed, shaking, his face buried in his hands. No battle, no threat, no enemy had ever broken him the way this night had. There was no revenge that could restore what had been taken. Within days, he slipped quietly out of Rome and returned to Ferrara a shattered man. He never spoke of that night again. But the story could not be buried. Word of the banquet spread like disease. Whispers in Roman streets became rumors across Italy, then encrypted letters sent to courts throughout Europe. Priests warned in coded sermons. Nobles read the reports in disbelief. The Venetian envoy wrote that what happened in the Vatican surpassed even the darkest tales of ancient Rome. He said the Pope had disgraced not only his daughter, but the entire church. The Borgias had long been feared, but now they were seen as corruption incarnate. In markets and taverns, people whispered their name as if it could still strike them down. Across Europe, preachers seized the story as proof of Rome's decay. Among them was a monk named Martin Luther. Years later, he would point to the Borgia feast as a symbol of everything rotten in the Vatican. And Johann Burchard, the man who saw it all, wrote every detail in his diary, his hands shaking as he recorded it. He knew his account might vanish forever under Vatican secrecy, or one day stand as the Church's most damning testimony. Lucrezia Borgia never escaped the shadow of that night. She moved to Ferrara and tried to build a quieter life as Duchess. She supported charities, protected artists, and nurtured learning. Yet those who knew her closely spoke of the same thing, a deep, unshakable sorrow in her eyes. She bore children with Alfonso, but their marriage, poisoned from the start, was only a shell. They lived beside each other, separated by a wound nothing could heal. Lucrezia died at 39, giving birth to her 8th child. On her deathbed, she asked for a priest and prayed until her final breath. Her last recorded words were simple: "I am ready to be free, at last." Freedom, something she had been denied her entire life. Alexander VI died only months after the rumor spread, whispering that poison, the weapon he had used so often, had finally found its way back to him. Cesare Borgia, stripped of power, was later ambushed and killed in Spain. His mutilated body was dumped into an unmarked grave, far from the glory he believed awaited him. But the night of October 30th, 1503, did not die with them. It became a symbol, a stain so dark it helped ignite the Protestant Reformation. Luther and others would invoke the Borgias again and again as proof of Vatican decay. The Counter-Reformation tried to erase them, but the truth endured. Centuries later, Burchard's diary resurfaced and dragged the night back into the light. Even now, more than 500 years later, the Chestnut Banquet and the Triple Shame remain infamous warnings of what happens when absolute power loses all restraint. They remind us that humanity's worst acts often unfold in the very places meant to be holy. Lucrezia Borgia's wedding night is more than history. It is a mirror, a warning, a reminder that evil often survives through silence. If you made it to the end of this account, write Borgia in the comments so we know you walked with us through this descent. And remember, the past is not dead. It watches. It warns.